had scientifically, whatever that meant in the first century, investigated the written and oral, the eyewitness traditions carefully. Luke was not himself an eyewitness of Christ and his life, but he had conducted interviews and checked out all his sources. So when we talk about the Gospels, what is a gospel? Well, the English word gospel comes from the Greek word evangelia, or some pronounce it euangelia. The word ev, or you, means good, and the word angelia means news or message. So, evangelia, good news, good message. Each of the Gospels, then, is a message of good news. Okay? That's where the word comes from. Now, who wrote the Gospels? Well, the first thing you need to know is that there are no originals left. No hand-signed copies by the apostles. However, I accept traditional authorship for three reasons. Number one, there's no evidence to the contrary. We've never found a copy of the Gospel of Matthew that was said to have been written by somebody else. Okay? All the church fathers, from as far back as we can go, right up against the end of the first century, accepted Matthew as the author of Matthew, and so on. And I think it's reasonable. We don't have any originals for Plato, Homer, Aristotle. Okay? But we accept their authorship. In fact, most of the time, what we're doing is we're accepting somebody's statement about their authorship. Somebody will quote Plato and say, Plato said. And somebody will quote Homer and say, Homer said. Okay? We certainly don't have any originals for any of those works either. Now, out of the four Gospels, three of them are called synoptic Gospels. They are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You need to know that the Greek word synoptikos, soon is the Greek preposition that means with. Optikos means sight or vision. All right? So when these two parts were put together, the idea is seeing the whole together, taking a comprehensive view of something. And apparently God, in his wisdom, believed that the church, and that is that you and I, needed multiple angles on the life of Christ. Not just one account of his life, but more than one account. And these Gospels are kind of like three different spotlights put at different angles, so we see Christ's life. Now, to understand why they're called synoptics, look at these statistics. Matthew shares 58% of the information in his Gospel with Mark and Luke, which is to say that only 42% of Matthew's Gospel is unique to him. Mark shares 93% of his Gospel with Matthew and Luke, and only 7% of Mark's material is unique. Luke, kind of the opposite of Matthew, 41% shared, 59% unique, so that certainly suggests that Luke had warrant for writing his Gospel. John, however, is the one that's kind of the odd man out. He only shares 8% of his material with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. 92% of John's Gospel is new information. So that's why John is not considered a synoptic Gospel. He's not looking at the same stuff. Matthew, Mark, and Luke share, at a minimum, 41% of, and in the case of Mark, up to 93%. Any questions about these statistics? All right, now we want to talk about the themes of the Gospels. Hopefully this is review from New Testament literature. But it's important that you understand that none of the Gospels are purely biographical, which means none of them are really just intended to trace the life of a person from beginning to end. Gospels are, in fact, a unique type of literature. They're a type of literature designed to inform and persuade an audience about a message. Okay, so we can call them thematic treatises. This, I believe, is a painting. I could be wrong. I think this is by Caravaggio, of the four gospel authors. And the guy with the sheet around him is supposedly Mark, because the Gospel of Mark includes account of a young man who wrapped a sheet around himself to follow Jesus as he's being taken away from the Garden of Gethsemane. Somebody grabs the sheet, he has to run away naked, and tradition assigns that to Mark. Exactly who is who in the other persons, I don't know. So just quickly, Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is the King of the Jews, the promised Messiah. And Matthew provides the credentials to prove that Jesus is in fact the anointed one who was promised in the Old Testament and who is the King of the Jews. So, for example, he starts with a genealogy that goes back to Abraham. If you're going to be a Jew, you've got to be related to Abraham. And it goes through David. So it demonstrates his right to the Davidic throne. Matthew uses the word kingdom 56 times, kingdom of heaven 32 times, son of David 10 times, indicators of his thematic interests. He devotes more space than any other gospel to the words of Christ. So we have the promised Messiah, the King of the Jews, and his teaching. And this is perhaps an example of an early Jewish apologetic. If you're going to be a Jew, you walk into a synagogue and you say, I know who the Messiah is. And they're like, yeah, right. How are you going to prove that this peasant from Nazareth, this peripatetic prophet, wandering prophet, is the Messiah? Well, Matthew quotes over 50 times from the Old Testament, connecting the life of Christ to the Old Testament prophecies. So it's almost like, let me show you, line them up, one after the other, after the other, after the other. Jesus did what the Old Testament was predicting. Mark's focus is that Jesus is the servant of God. There's no mention of Jesus' birth. He uses the word immediately 41 times, and he uses the historical present for a vivid portrayal. Mark is kind of like the radio announcer. I now take you to the gates of Jerusalem, and Jesus is walking through, and a man sitting there by the gates is saying, Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy on me. It was a dream. It's time to wake up. Okay, Mark tries to pull us into the action. He's very much an action gospel, so to speak. Not an action thriller, but an action gospel. Okay, it appears to be written to a Gentile audience, traditionally regarded as written to the Romans. And some of the evidence that supports Mark's focus was Gentile. Clement of Alexandria in Eusebius affirms this. And we get a lot of translation of Aramaic expressions. If you were writing to Jews, you wouldn't need to translate Aramaic expressions. Mark translates Boanerges, sons of thunder, Talitha Kumi, little girl arise, Korban, which means gift, Ephphatha, Abba, Eloi, Eloi. All of those are Aramaic words that have been transliterated into Greek. And then he says what this means is, and then he gives the Greek equivalent. Okay. Also, he uses Latin terms. He talks about lepta, copper coins, which make a quadrans. That's another kind of Roman coin. he calls the palace the Praetorian. Okay, well that's, again, a Latin term. So he explains Jewish customs. For example, the Jews don't eat unless they carefully wash their hands, all of which seems irrelevant if you're writing to a Jewish audience. So I think that's really good evidence for Mark's audience focus being Gentile. The key verse, Mark 10:45, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Any questions? Okay, so that brings us to Luke. Luke focuses on the humanity of Jesus. It's from Luke that we learn of Jesus' hunger, his tiredness, his thirst, his growth as a child. So Matthew, Jesus, the anointed one, the King of the Jews. Mark, Jesus, the servant of mankind. Luke, Jesus is the Son of Man, his humanity. The purpose of Luke, we are told in verse 4, is that somebody named Theophilus would know for certain the things he had been taught. Scholars have never been able to agree as to whether Theophilus is a person, it's a real name, a code name for a person, or maybe even a code name for a group of people. Okay. So that's the information about Luke. I'm surprised that I don't have on that slide that Luke's genealogy runs from Adam. He takes Jesus all the way back to Adam, whereas Matthew only went to Abraham. The difference then focusing on his humanity, his connection to the first Adam, for Christ himself is the second Adam. What the first Adam failed to do, that is, overcome temptation, the second Adam will do. What the first Son of God failed to do, Israel, the second Son of God will do. He will be in the wilderness not because of his sin, but because he's led there by the Spirit. He will not fail in temptation, but overcome it. Okay? And so we actually have a multi-level recapitulation of the life of Adam and the life of Israel in the person of Christ. And Jesus doing for us and for Israel what they and we did not do. John. John's focus is that Jesus is the Son of God, the deity of Christ. Now, and we know this from John 20:31, these things have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. All right, let's talk for a moment about the origin of the synoptics. There are two basic theories of where the synoptics come from. The first is called the two-source theory. Proponents of this theory were originally liberals, and the way I use the term liberal in this class, it means somebody who does not believe the Bible is inspired, who doesn't believe you have to be born again, who doesn't believe Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, that's what I mean by the word liberal. Okay, but it started out being proposed primarily by liberals, though some evangelicals have come to accept it. Conservative evangelicals, meaning they believe the Bible is inspired and inerrant, the new birth is necessary, and there are liberal evangelicals who are not sure that the Bible is inerrant, but they still think the new birth is necessary. Okay. Here's the content of the two-source view. The idea is that Mark was written first, then Matthew and Luke both borrow from Mark. Okay. And here's some of the data that's used to argue for this position. There are 661 verses in Mark. Of these, 606 occur in some form in Matthew, 380 occur in some form in Luke. There are only 30 unique Markan verses. Okay. The two-source theory then says that Matthew and Luke get the rest of their material from an unknown source, and that unknown source is called Q. Q is because the Germans who first came up with this idea, the word for source in German is Quelle. And so Q comes from the German word Quelle,